They called her nobody, not in cruelty's careless slip, but with intention, the way a smith stamps a mark into iron to say what the metal is worth. She had scrubbed the floors of Ironhall Keep for 3 years, her hands red to the wrists before the first bell, her shoulder bound in linen so tight it sometimes made her dizzy by mid-morning. She had answered to girl and you there, and fetched the water. And she had never once let the answer become a weapon. The world had decided who she was. She had simply declined to agree. What the world did not know, what only an elder laundress named Petra and a gruff garrison captain named Aldrich had known for 3 long years, was that beneath that bound linen lived a mark pressed into the skin of her left shoulder since birth. A crest of 3 interlocked rings and a single upward blade, the royal seal of House Carath. The blood mark of a line the Lord Steward had declared extinct in a single forged entry in the year 1044. She would not remain nobody. On the night of the Ashfall tithe, year 1047, a pail would tip, the linen would soak through, and 40 witnesses would see what the steward had spent 3 years trying to bury. By the following dawn, before 43 titled alphas and council elders gathered for the blood moon conclave, a king would bend his knee on cold stone floor. This is how it happened. The keep rose from a granite ridge above the Verith Valley, its walls the color of old smoke. Winter came to that ridge early and stayed late. On the eve of the Ashfall tithe, year 1047, the fires in the great hall burned from before dawn, not for warmth exactly, but because warmth was part of the ceremony, part of the keep's presentation to the titled lords arriving in hired carriages with banners stiff in the frozen air. Someone had to lay the fires. Someone had to polish the floor of gray-veined stone until it gave back a man's face to him like a mirror. That someone was Marin. She was 22, lean from work rather than hunger, her dark hair pinned under a linen coif, so the lords would not have to acknowledge the presence of the girl on her knees at their feet. She had a healer's hands, steady and certain, an inheritance from her mother, who had died of fever when Marin was 9 and from whom she had learned the names of 37 medicinal plants before she could name all the months of the year. Her father had taught her the rest, the ones her mother would not have approved of. The plants that stopped pain fast and hard, the compounds that fought corruption in a wound. He had taught her until the year she turned 14, when the Lord Steward Voss had brought a charge of treason against him in a closed session of the Pack Council, presented a forged registry, and had him stripped of name and seat, and then quietly, efficiently, killed. Marin had survived by becoming invisible. Petra had helped her do that. Petra was 63, wide and slow and apparently unremarkable, and she had known Marin's father. She had known what the mark on the girl's shoulder meant. She had bound it herself the morning after the execution, using linen strips soaked in a tannin solution that darkened the skin just enough to obscure the crest's edges if anyone looked. "Keep your head down," Petra had told her. "Not forever. Just until you know what you're carrying. 3 years." Marin had carried it 3 years. Aldrich found her that morning at the edge of the great hall, her pail on the floor beside her and a fresh cake of stone soap in her hand. He was 41, scarred along his jaw from a dispute that predated his posting here, and he moved with the particular heaviness of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. He crouched beside her without greeting, which was how he always spoke when he wanted to say something real. 43 lords arriving today," he said, his voice low. "Voss is in a mood. Voss is always in a mood the week of the tithe. More so this year." He looked at the floor, not at her. "The king's delegation arrives before supper. Sebastian Stoneheart and 6 of his inner guard. Voss requested they be housed in the east wing." Marin kept moving the brush in slow circles. "East wing has no garrison access." "That's the point." She looked at him then. Something in his jaw was set wrong, the way it went when he was working out a worry he had not yet put into words. I'm not the one you should be warning, she said. You're the only one who listens. He stood, straightening with effort. Keep the shoulder bound today. Tighter than usual. Voss has been watching the new servants. He left before she could ask what that meant specifically. She retied the linen binding under her dress with her teeth and her free hand, cinching it against her shoulder blade until the skin went numb, and then she picked up the pail and went back to the floor. The king's delegation arrived at the sixth bell, before supper as Aldrich had said, and the keep rearranged itself around them the way a room rearranges around a fire someone has just lit. Servants straightened their collars. The cook sent a runner for the second joint of roasted meat. Even the dogs in the courtyard quieted. Marin was working the corridor near the east passage when the inner guard came through. 6 men in gray and black, who moved in a formation that required no announcement. She pressed herself to the wall, head low, Pail at her feet, and watched the floor. She heard his step last, heavier than the others, not from weight, but from certainty. The tread of a man who had never once in his life considered whether the floor would hold. She did not look up. She was very careful not to look up. The procession passed within 4 feet of her, and the air moved, and she felt something she had no name for. A pressure at the base of her throat, a heat that had nothing to do with the corridor torches, a pull like a current beneath the surface of still water. She told herself it was the crowding, the bodies in a narrow hall, the torchlight. She did not look up. She heard him stop. The pause lasted 3 seconds, no more. Then the step resumed, and the corridor emptied into the east wing, and Marin stood with her hands around the pail handle until she could feel the cold metal through her palms again. The great hall preparations took her through supper and past the 8th bell when the Ashfall tithe ceremony was set to begin. The titled lords filled the hall in their finery, cups already in hand, a noise of 40 voices bouncing off stone. Marin worked the far end with a smaller pail and a polishing cloth, keeping to the edges, invisible as she had been for 3 years. The pail caught the corner of a trestle foot she had not seen in the low light. It went over with a sound like a struck bell, cold water spreading fast across the polished stone, and Marin was on her knees before the wave reached the nearest boots, cloth in hand, trying to contain it. The water soaked through her dress. It soaked through the wrapped shoulder cloth. The linen had been dry before this. Now it was wet through in 20 seconds, pressing flat against her shoulder, and the tannin-darkened edges of the wrap meant nothing once the fabric went transparent with water. She did not know anyone had seen until she heard the silence. Not the silence of a hall where nothing was happening, but the silence of 40 people in a room deciding together that something required their attention. She kept her hands moving, mopping water, head down, and she heard Voss's voice from across the hall with the particular clarity of a sound that has been sharpened by dread. "Bring her up." 2 of the steward's men had her by the arms before she could straighten. They pulled her to her feet with the impersonal efficiency of men acting on a standing order, and she found herself in the center of the great hall with the polished floor she had spent the day preparing spread around her, and 40 titled lords watching from the edges. Voss crossed the room at a measured pace. He was 60. Lean in the way old cruelty makes a man lean, with pale eyes that moved across a room the way a ledger-keeper's finger moves across figures. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her shoulder, where the wet linen had gone thin as gauze, and his expression did not change. That was the most frightening thing about him. Nothing changed his expression because nothing surprised him. He had spent years preparing for contingencies, and this, apparently, was one of them. "Remove the cloth," he said. "My lord," she said, and her voice held steady, which she knew was the only thing she could give herself in that moment. "I am a servant in this keep. I have done nothing but my work. Remove the cloth, or my men will remove it for you." He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. She reached up and unwrapped it herself. She would not give him the other thing. The crest lay bare on her left shoulder, the 3 interlocked rings sharp and dark against her skin, the upward blade unmistakable. She heard the sound move through the room like a wave, a collective breath drawn in by 40 men who knew exactly what they were looking at. A forgery, Voss announced, and his voice carried to every corner. A claim of false blood, worn against pack law. He turned to address the room. This woman will be remanded to the lower cells pending formal accusation of lineage fraud. The mark is a fabrication. The line of House Carath was declared extinct in 1044 by proper registry, duly witnessed and sealed. He looked at Marin once more. Take her down. She was sentenced in the Great Hall of Ironhall Keep before 40 witnesses, in the year 1047, on the eve of the Ashfall Tithe, for wearing the crest of a bloodline a forged ledger had already killed. If you have ever watched someone who should be powerful stand perfectly still while the room declares them nothing, leave a thought below and stay with the story. The lower cells were carved into the bedrock beneath the east foundation, cold in a way that was less about temperature than about the complete absence of any warmth that had ever been generated by a living thing. Marin sat on the stone shelf that served as a bench and listened to the keep settle above her, the muffled sounds of the tithe ceremony proceeding without interruption. 40 lords drinking and swearing alliance while she sat in the dark with her shoulder bare and her hands still wet from the floor. Petra would know by morning. Aldrich would know within the hour. She could not imagine what either of them could do with the knowledge before the formal accusation was filed at the conclave dawn, which was less than 2 days from now. The Ashfall conclave opened at first light on the second day of the tithe week. 43 titled alphas and council elders would sit in formal session. A lineage accusation, once formally entered, would be heard in that session. She was still working through the shape of that problem when she heard them bring him in. She heard it before she understood it. The sound of men under strain. 3 sets of boots moving with the particular urgency of people managing a weight that required their full attention, and low voices saying things to each other in tight, controlled phrases. They put him in the cell adjoining hers, the largest of the lower cells, and she heard the iron door shut, and then a sound she did not immediately place. A ragged, shallow breathing like a man trying to find the bottom of a breath and not quite reaching it. She moved to the bars between the cells. The light was bad, a single pitch torch in the corridor throwing orange light at an angle that showed her very little. She could see a shape against the far wall, seated on the stone shelf with his head back and both hands open on his knees, which was not a posture of rest, but of a man conserving every resource he had. "How long?" she said, keeping her voice down. The breathing paused. Then, carefully, "Since the evening meal." Silver poisoning from ingestion moved in a particular way she recognized from her mother's notes and her own 3 years of quietly maintained study. The first 3 hours were heat and disorientation. The second 3 were the deep cold, the one that came from inside and could not be addressed by any external warmth. Then came the fever that oscillated, high and crashing low, for as long as the toxin remained active in the blood. 3 days was the duration a healthy wolf-born body could manage it without intervention. Anything shorter required either an antidote or a constitution she had no way to assess. "Was it the wine?" she said. Another pause, longer this time. "My steward's selection." She looked at her hands. She looked at the bars. She looked at the shape of the man in the adjacent cell, the king of every pack and territory in the northern range, breathing through silver-poisoned blood in a cell below the keep of the man who had put the poison there. "I have healer's training," she said. "Some of it." The head turned, and even in the bad light she felt the quality of his attention change, the way the air in a room changes when something that had been still decides to move. "There is an antidote formula," she said. Your steward will have it in his scriptorium. If he is the one who administered this, he would keep it. A man like that keeps every mechanism by which he might reverse a decision. You know him. I know what he is. The breathing steadied slightly. Not from improvement in his condition, she thought, but from a decision made. What is your name? Marin. He said nothing else. He did not offer his own name, which she already knew. She did not offer the rest of what she knew about herself. The shoulder, the crest, the erased registry. That could wait. What could not wait was the silver working through him. She called for the corridor guard and told him she required clean water, salt, and any dried white bark the keep's stores held. She said it the way her mother had taught her to say things that needed to happen, without question in her voice, and without the particular deference that invited refusal. The guard hesitated. Then he went. Through that night and the next day she worked through the bars as best she could, mixing the white bark with the salt water into a compress that drew surface heat, pressing it through the gap at the bottom of the iron grate, talking him through the oscillation when it hit its worst. The fever moved in 4-hour cycles. She tracked them by the torch changes in the corridor and the sounds of the keep above. When he was coherent, he was very quiet, the kind of quiet that was not absence but compression, a man who had learned to put everything behind a single held line. Once, near the second dawn, the compression broke. She had just passed a fresh compress through the grate and his hand had closed over hers to take it, and neither of them moved for a moment, and she felt the thing she had felt in the corridor above again, but larger now, no longer a current beneath still water but something with direction, something that knew where it was pointed. His hand was cold from the silver and her fingers were raw from the compress work, and none of that was the point. The point was that he did not let go immediately. He held on for 4 seconds longer than the compress required. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a small specific thing that cost him something in the state he was in, and then he released her hand and she pulled it back through the grate and neither of them spoke about it. She told herself it was gratitude from a man reduced to his lowest resources. She told herself this without quite believing it. On the morning of the second day, Aldrich appeared at the cell corridor. He had a guard with him who was not the usual guard, a young man from the lower garrison with honest eyes and a nervous posture that suggested he understood exactly the risk of what he was doing. Aldrich crouched at her cell door and slid a folded piece of vellum through the gap at the base. "Petra sent word," he said quietly. "She knew your father's formula records. She kept copies all these years. The white bark is right but incomplete. There are 2 more compounds." He tapped the vellum with one finger. "The full formula. The rest of what you need is in the scriptorium's north cabinet. East wall, north cabinet, 3rd shelf from the floor." She unfolded the vellum. 2 additions, powdered iron moss and a precise measure of rendered coltsfoot oil. The quantities were written in Petra's hand. Exact, unhurried. The hand of a woman who had kept this paper ready and had always known the day would come. "How does Voss not know you're here?" she asked Aldrich. "He's occupied." His jaw went to the angle she recognized. "He's announced a severance right at the Ashfall conclave, formally entered this morning. Says the king's incapacity constitutes an abandonment of the throne claim, and the right will transfer pack authority to the council, pending a new ascension." He watched her read the vellum again. "Conclave opens tomorrow at first light. If the right proceeds, the throne falls and the new council selects the acting authority. Voss has the votes lined up. He's been lining them up for 2 years." There it was. The shape of the whole plan, finally visible all at once. The silver poisoning had not been an assassination attempt. It had been a mechanism for incapacity. A king who could not stand before his council at the conclave could not dispute a severance right. Voss needed the throne, not Sebastian's death. A dead king was a martyr. A king declared incapacitated and bypassed was a precedent. She looked at the vellum. She looked at the corridor, at the distance between this cell and the east passage. The scriptorium, she said. Where does Voss have his evening watch posted? Aldrich told her. The guard with the honest eyes and the nervous posture let her out of the cell for 1 hour, at the dead window between the third and fourth night watch change, when the east passage was as close to empty as it would ever be. She moved through the keep the way she had moved through it for 3 years, along the servant routes, below the sight lines of the formal corridors, through a door beside the kitchen passage that was never locked, because no one of consequence used it. The scriptorium was cold and smelled of old wax. She found the north cabinet by feel as much as sight, the third shelf from the floor. The powdered iron moss was in a sealed jar with a wax stopper. The colt's foot oil was in a flask beside it. She took both, closed the cabinet, and was back in the east passage in under 8 minutes. The guard with the honest eyes was waiting. He said nothing, and she said nothing, and they went back to the lower cells. She brewed the full compound in a clay cup over a candle stub, working from the proportions on Petra's vellum, watching the consistency with the attention her mother had put into her before she had any understanding of what she was being prepared for. The iron moss changed the color to a pale gray-green. The coltsfoot oil thickened it slightly and would carry the compound through the blood barrier that silver erected. She had read her mother's notes enough times to recite them. She had never done this specific thing before. She did it now. She passed the cup through the bars. He drank it without question, which was either trust or the pragmatism of a man too ill to be particular. And she decided it was both, and that both were a form of the same thing. She watched him through the rest of that night, tracking the oscillation cycle, waiting for the fever's fourth peak to arrive and fail to arrive, which was how the antidote announced itself, not with a dramatic change, but with an absence. The fever that should have spiked at the 4-hour mark simply not appearing. By the time the upper keep began its pre-dawn noise, the warming fires being laid, the kitchen beginning its bread work, the first bells ringing in the yard, he was sitting upright with his color returned and his breathing clear. He looked at her through the bars for a long moment. "The mark on your shoulder," he said. "I saw it in the corridor. Before any of this." She met his eyes. "I know. House Carath." He said it the way a man says a thing he has been thinking about for some time. "The registry declares the line extinct. The registry is forged. Voss entered it himself in 1044, 3 months after my father's execution on fabricated charges. The original seal was my father's. He used it to remove my father's seat and take it for himself." She kept her voice flat, because flat was the only register that did not crack under the weight of what she was saying. One forged ledger, one stolen seal. That is all it took. He was quiet for a moment. "The conclave is at first light," she said. "Can you walk?" He stood slowly but completely without using the wall. He was taller than she had registered in the dark, wide-shouldered and certain-edged, the compression back in place but different now. Less like concealment and more like capacity. He looked at the cell door. He looked at her. "The conclave," he said, and his voice had its full weight back in it, "is going to be a different kind of meeting than Voss prepared for." She was condemned a second time before she saw the inside of the conclave hall. Voss had moved early, filing the lineage fraud charge formally with the conclave registrar before first light, which meant that when the 43 titled alphas and council elders took their seats in the great hall of Ironhall Keep, Marin arrived not as a claimant or a witness, but as a prisoner, brought in by 2 of Voss's men to stand at the low end of the dais, below the level of the assembly, exactly where the flagstone still held the ghost of her morning's labor from 2 days prior. The hall looked different in conclave configuration. The trestle tables were gone, replaced by tiered benches in a horseshoe, 43 faces turned inward toward the dais. The great fires burned. The banners of each attending pack hung from the upper rail, 43 colors in the firelight. Voss stood at the center of the dais in his steward's formal robe, the forged ledger already open on the speaking table beside him, his posture easy in the way of a man reading from a prepared text. He built his case in measured sentences. The mark was a forgery, painted or burned into the skin by any number of methods available to those willing to commit such deception. The registry was clear. The line was extinct. The woman had infiltrated the king's keep for unknown purposes, and in the king's current incapacity, the conclave was obligated to act on the severance right petition already formally entered. Marin stood at the low end of the dais. Her shoulder was bare, the mark visible, and she let it be visible because there was nothing else left to be strategic about. She watched the 43 faces and she counted the ones who were looking at the mark, not Voss. And she kept counting. And she thought about her father's execution and her mother's herb notes, and 3 years of cold floors and a cup brewed by candlelight, and a hand that had held on 4 seconds longer than necessary, and she did not let any of it reach her face. She heard it before she understood it, the same way she had heard the procession 2 nights ago. A shift in the room, a change in the quality of the silence. The 43 faces turned, not toward Voss, not toward her, but toward the hall's main entrance. And she turned too. He stood in the open doorway, Sebastian Stoneheart, king of the northern range and every pack beneath it, fully upright and fully present, wearing no ceremonial robe but his own authority, which was sufficient. He was pale still from 3 days of silver fever, but his eyes were clear, and the line of him was absolute. Behind him stood 4 of his inner guard. Beside him, a step behind and to the left, stood Aldrich. Aldrich, who had smuggled the formula vellum. Aldrich, who had known this was coming and had positioned himself where he needed to be. The 43 faces had gone entirely still. Voss had not moved, but something had left his posture, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a flame goes when the air that fed it is cut off. He was holding a breath he could not release. Sebastian crossed the hall. He moved at an even pace that required the room to wait for him, which it did. He stopped at the foot of the dais, looked at Voss, looked at the ledger on the speaking table, and then looked at Marin. And she saw something in his face that had not been there in the cell. Not because it was new, but because it was no longer behind anything. "The registry," he said, and his voice was conversational, but it carried to every corner. "Open it to the entry of the 7th month, year 1044. Voss did not move. Sebastian looked at him. One of the inner guard stepped forward and opened the ledger himself, turning to the page with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been told exactly which page to find. "Read the seal notation," Sebastian said, still to the room. The guard read it aloud. A hush went around the horseshoe of benches like a wind through a room with no windows. Sebastian turned to the assembly. "The seal used to register the extinction of House Carath in 1044 carries the notary mark of this keep's Lord Steward, not the Pack Council's sanctioned registrar. That notation makes the entry a private document with no binding pack authority. The registry is not forged." He paused. "The registry is simply not what it was claimed to be. It was never a council record. It was Voss's personal accounting of a decision he made alone, in secret, and then presented to the council as their own act." He reached into his guard's pack and produced a second document, one Marin had not seen before, which Aldrich had apparently carried out of this same scriptorium while she had been retrieving the antidote compounds, because Aldrich had known exactly what he was looking for, had been looking for it for longer than she knew. The original title record of House Carath, witnessed and sealed by 3 pack elders in year 1031, naming Marin, daughter of Caray of House Carath, as blood heir to the northern seat. He set it on the speaking table beside Voss's ledger. The 2 documents sat side by side. The hall could see them both. The elder at the far end of the horseshoe bench, A woman of 70, who had been attending conclaves since before Marin was born, rose to her feet. She crossed the floor with the deliberate authority of someone who has nothing left to prove to anyone. She examined the original seal. She examined Voss's notation. She looked at Marin's shoulder, at the 3 interlocked rings and the upward blade, and she nodded once, the way someone nods when the world has confirmed what they already knew. "The mark is genuine," she said, to the room, to the full assembly. "I sat on the council in 1031. I witnessed that record sealed. The child before you carries House Carath's blood. The lineage was never lawfully extinguished." Voss moved then, finally, reaching for the ledger, which was an error so complete it would have been pitiable if she had any pity left for him. 3 of Sebastian's guard were between him and the table before his hand reached it. He stood in the center of the dais with no object left to reach for, and the hall watching him. And the thing that had left his posture earlier finished leaving now. He looked, for the first time in Marin's memory, like a man who had run out of prepared text. Sebastian turned to the assembly. By pack law, a lineage claim confirmed by a sitting elder cannot be disputed by private registry. Voss entered a false account and presented it as council authority to seize a titled seat. The charge is fraud against the pack council and against a blood heir. He looked at the 2 men beside Voss. "Remove him from this hall." It was said without heat, which was the only way he seemed to say things. They removed him. The forged ledger went with him, into evidence, its single seal and single lie, finally in the hands of the body it had deceived. The false severance right petition died at the same moment, formally withdrawn from the dais record by the conclave registrar without ceremony, a clerk scratching a line through a page, which was all it had ever deserved. The hall was very quiet. Sebastian turned from the registrar's table and looked at Marin, who was still standing at the low end of the dais where Voss's men had placed her. Her shoulder still bare, her hands still the hands of a woman who had brewed an antidote by candlelight and scrubbed a floor by the first bell, and 3 years ago had decided not to let the world make her into what it wanted her to be. He stepped off the dais. She understood what he was doing a second before he did it, and she could not tell him to stop. And she did not want to. He went down on one knee on the flagstones at her feet, the flagstones she had polished, the floor she knew. The sound that moved through the assembly was not gasping or ceremony. It was the sound of 43 people understanding simultaneously that a thing they had believed fixed had just moved. "Marin of House Carath," he said, and his voice was low, but the hall was so quiet it reached every bench. "Blood heir to the northern seat, and more than that." He held her gaze, and she knew what the more than that carried, all of it, the corridor and the bars and the 4 seconds and the compass of his attention, since before she had known he was paying it. "You are owed a restoration no registry can complete. I can only offer what I have." She looked at him on one knee on the floor she had spent 3 years on her own knees over, and she felt something come loose in her chest that she recognized as the 3 years themselves, the wound finally allowed to breathe for the first time since it was made. She did not perform composure. She did not collapse. She stood with her shoulder bare and her chin level, and she reached down and touched the side of his face, once, with her raw-knuckled hand. "Get up," she said softly. He did. One by one, beginning with the elder who had spoken first, the 43 titled alphas and council elders rose from their benches and inclined their heads. Not all of them willingly, not all of them without the particular discomfort of people being asked to revise a long-held position. It did not matter. They did it. The room that had condemned her 2 days ago in the same firelight with the same fires burning completed its long, slow turn. She let herself look at all of them. Then she looked at Aldrich, who was standing at the edge of the dais with his scarred jaw working and his eyes bright. And she held his gaze until he nodded, and she nodded back. Petra was in the corridor outside the hall, because Petra was not allowed inside by rank, which was itself a thing the conclave would be addressing in the days to come. Marin found her there after the assembly dispersed, the old woman sitting on a stone bench with her hands in her lap, and when she saw Marin she stood with the particular effort of someone whose knees had given her decades of trouble, and she opened her arms without a word. Marin stepped into them. They stayed like that for a long moment, and the corridor was cold, and the fires from the great hall pushed warmth under the door, and Petra smelled like tannin and dried rosemary and 3 years of kept secrets. "Your father would have recognized the floor," Petra said into her hair. Marin did not answer that, because there was nothing to say to it that would not take an hour to say properly. She held on instead. In the days that followed the conclave, Voss was formally remanded to the Pack Council's tribunal, where the forged ledger and the confiscated seal provided evidence sufficient that the proceedings required very little additional time. The northern seat was formally reinstated to House Carath. Petra's indenture was dissolved by a written order Sebastian signed in the East Wing on the morning of the third day, which Aldrich carried to her with the solemnity of a man delivering something he had personally ensured would arrive. Aldrich's posting, a posting he had maintained at cost for 3 years while knowing what he knew and waiting for the moment it could be used, was confirmed as permanent. It was not a quiet week or a simple one. There were 43 lords who needed the events of the conclave explained and re-explained in formal correspondence, and a registrar who needed to unfile and refile half a decade of pack records, and a keep that had been administered by a man now in tribunal custody, which meant there was no one to assign the morning fires, or order the bread, or ensure the lower cells were properly maintained. Marin found herself doing some of that, not from habit or compulsion, but because it was in front of her, and she knew how. On the 7th morning after the conclave, she walked the length of the great hall, not with a pail, not with a brush. She walked from the far end where she had tipped the pail and gone to her knees, across the length of gray-veined stone that she knew foot by foot and seam by seam, to the dais at the other end. Aldrich was at her left side. Petra was at her right, moving with her particular slow deliberateness, one hand on Aldrich's arm. The fires were burning. The morning light came through the high windows at an angle that lit the floor and made it look like water. Her left shoulder was bare. She had considered binding it this morning and decided against it, not from performance or announcement, but because the shoulder cloth had been protection, and protection was no longer what she needed from it. The mark sat in the light as it had sat in the dark for 22 years. The 3 interlocked rings and the upward blade, exactly as her father had described it to her once, when she was 7, before she had known what describing it would cost him. She stopped in the center of the hall. Beside her, Petra's hand found hers and held it. Marin looked at the floor and let it be just a floor, cold stone and her own reflection looking back at her, a face she recognized, a woman still standing. She had kept the mark. She had kept herself. The rest would follow.